So I fixed Silas's lips in there and my neck. I might have to add some more brown to it though. We'll see. I didn't really do much. I colored in the arm and whatever. That's James's dinner. It's meatless tips by Gardein with peas, celery, garlic, rice fried up. And I put onions with his, and he had some strawberries left over, so he gets to eat more cake and strawberries today. And he was going to talk to you about something, but I can't remember what it was.
Well, it was going to be about the so-called Exodus, but more about the 10 plagues of Egypt and stuff like that. But I was going to bring I forgot to check that stuff that you did for me on the internet. So I've got to work through that. But the Passover happened, if my understanding is correct, kind of like on the vernal equinox. So it's easy to remember when it was, right? It's Easter.
Yeah.
So at least around there. Easter, I don't think, is always on the vernal equinox. This year, it's a little later. Around that time, and the Passover was the Jewish celebration. Years later, by the time Jesus came around, it would be more than 1850 years later. The traditional dating for the Exodus, when the Exodus isn't supposed to have happened, is around 1200 BC, and that's way off. 1850. The period of Judges lasted a long time, about 700 years. 800. About 800 years. And ended with King Saul, according to the story. And I suspect there was something very much like King Saul and his successor David and David's son Solomon. Of course, there's great skepticism.
Do you think that is because of people appropriating somebody else's history?
Well, basically, that's what's happened with secular so-called humanists. They're not terrible. They don't like. They're in the humanities, but they're not humanists. They don't believe in enlightenment or anything like that. But or most of them nowadays, ever since the 60s. The 60s crazies came through and started dominating universities. By the 90s, it was nuts. And it's now their successors have taken over, and in some ways it's not here yet. At any rate, it's in this case it's just appropriating and dismissing. So if they did that, if they talked the way they talk about Jewish myth, legend, and history, some of it's pretty darn good history in the Old Testament, about let's say indigenous myth, legend, and history, they just get witch hunted. They see it as a firing, much deserved firing, but it's witch hunting. So academics have always been good at witch hunting. They witch hunted Galileo. It was academics that went after him. It was academics that Copernicus was afraid of when he published, basically at his death, in essence posthumously, his work on the nature of what he saw as the universe, which is ultimately just talking about the solar system and stuff like that, where the planets have these circular orbits. He was wrong, actually. His stuff doesn't work out. The calculations don't work out because the planets follow elliptical orbits. They go like this. Of course, I'm exaggerating. They don't go in perfectly circular orbits. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't until, I think, Copernicus published 1543 maybe, and it wasn't until a little after 1600, it wasn't that long, 2 generations later.
I don't like these meat.
Yeah, they look too much like meat to me, but
I don't know.
I'll take them down somewhere or another.
No, I'm sure they're healthy for us.
Yeah, well, they're healthier than meat. That's all I'm worried about. Beef is not good for people. You know, I'm not necessarily going to say like K.D. Lang said, beef stinks. That cost her a certain demographic in the country field. You know, people were boycotting her and stuff like that. But ethically what they do to beef, especially veal, like little calves, is shameful, and that stinks. But at any rate, and it's not healthy for people. I'm sorry, especially with all the fat that they've got in. When I was a kid, I hated meat, and I particularly hated fat and gristle. I swear my parents must have thought I was going to be a surgeon, because I just sit there picking this stuff out, sawing it up and all this sort of stuff. I don't think they realized how much fat I smuggled out in my socks and in my trousers pockets to chuck in the garbage and stuff like that, because that's what I do with it. And my brother expressed older brother expressed some jealousy later on. I mean, it was kind of healthy. He was saying, he's reading a report, and there might have been at least a grain of truth to it, maybe a whole salt lick of truth. And it said that kids who cleaned up their plates when they were younger, or grown-ups who cleaned up their plates as kids, tended towards overweight, and those who were persnickety, or however you want to pronounce it, like me, tended to be something like a proper weight.
Yeah, well, the thing was, with my mom, I would not eat her food. I did not like it. I would literally starve myself to avoid it. And, but my grandma lived nearby, and I loved her cooking. And grandma would let me eat whatever I wanted and not eat whatever I wanted. I could take what I wanted, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I like your mom, but I liked your grandma too. I wish she were still around. She's basically 100% Ukrainian, although unlike most Ukrainians that I've met, she had quite dark skin, and before I met her, she had, you're saying, very dark hair. Like that. So, yeah, she treated me very nicely, I've got to say. Both of your grandmas treated me very nicely. I appreciate that. And your mom's treated me very nicely. And your sister. Didn't really get to know your dad very much. He was kind of withdrawn, so it was hard to get to know him. Anyway, we're going to talk about
Vernal equinox.
The vernal equinox. So you'll have to wait if you're just sitting on the edge of your seat finding out what actually happened. But from what I can tell, the description of what were you going to say?
Well, I can turn it off if you're going to tell them it's going to wait.
No, I'm going to give some preliminary
Okay.
But they'll have to wait for the detailed stuff with the globe. And I've got a book of constellations show you, but I kind of figured the configuration of the heavens were I shouldn't use the heavens, the skies or whatever, night skies, tending towards the morning sky. So the description in the Exodus of the Sea of Passage, as Velikovsky had mentioned before, I'm pretty sure he points out that the waters didn't part. They just went one way up the Red Sea in anticipation of a big tidal wave coming in. This is what happens. It's commonly known amongst people who live where tidal waves occur. So there was one that happened in Indonesia, a tidal wave. Was it this millennium? Something like that, 20 years ago maybe. And the people that really got wiped out were the tourists. Because when the water went out in anticipation of the tide coming back in again, apparently with a big tidal wave, it can be an hour's wait. So the tide pulled out, and maybe that an hour's fun time picking shells or whatever. Because apparently that's what some of them were doing. They went, hey, where'd the ocean go? Look, there's shells. Then the tidal wave came in, and they didn't last too well. Whereas the people who lived there were heading for whatever was a reasonable facsimile for a hill. I think a lot of places around there were pretty low lying, even well inland. But it'd be a lot better than being on this makeshift beach where the water would run. So I think Velikovsky, 1950, when he published, he was researching worlds in collision for 10 years, according to his own account, from 1940 to 1950, published Worlds in Collision, 1950. So I've been promising, or warning, in case you're a true believer in everything that Velikovsky said, I've been warning or promising, I'll explain how he got the astronomy so wrong. He's absolutely right about comets hitting the world in historical times. Absolutely right. Comets and or meteorites. He's talking about comets, and he's saying people are, like people with long traditions are legitimately right to be afraid of comets. Like the Enlightenment folks were going around laughing at what they saw as primitive people who were scared of comets. So we passed through the tail of a comet a while back. When was that? About 1900 or something like that. And they were going, see, there's no poison gases. It's not the tail or tails that cause the problems. It's in the head of the comet. And it's when it hits the world. You only have to look at the moon to know that the solar system, and by extension the universe, is not a happy, friendly place all the time. The big craters on the moon are huge. They're not like what you see near Flagstaff, Arizona. Okay? We got that clear? They're huge. Huge impacts. And then there are the mares, which are the so-called seas. And there's the tranquil sea, and there's the sea of nectar, and the sea of storms, and so on and so forth. Those, I don't see how you can escape it. Those are huge craters, big craters that have been overlaid by medium-sized craters, and then those medium-sized craters, some of them have been overlaid. Like you'll see little crater impacts within the bowl of these medium-sized craters. Now, what did he get wrong? He dug up so much material. I hate to use that term rich. I see all these nifty, shifty, hefty lefties. Rich. This is rich. They're describing some, and they're going, I go, what? This sounds like capitalism. Or are they talking about cake or something like that? But he dug up a lot of material, stuff that I'm still kind of going through. Like he dug up the material on the comet that hit Egypt, according to one of the classical authors, being in the sign of Capra, key. Chinese tradition that records some sort of disaster really before their history starts. You have to call it really more legend than history. And that's in the asteroid. It was not really the asteroid. It's associated with the star Yin. And the sources that I've got indicates that's Eta Aquarius. And like the astronomers should have been going, Eta Aquarius, there's a meteor shower associated with Eta Aquarius, and when they can, they identify these meteor showers with comets. Oh boy, they were too busy making fun of Velikovsky, and eventually they managed to witch hunt him into virtual oblivion. You talk to a younger pup nowadays. I was talking to someone who's about 25 yesterday. He hadn't heard it of him. His dad, who was there too, he had heard of Velikovsky. So, like about 30 years later, a generation, they managed to witch hunt him into, in essence, oblivion. I'm here to right that wrong, and it's a wrong. It's a huge wrong. All these guys from, what was the name of the skunk who started off the witch hunt? It's easy to forget his name because he's such a non-entity. Harlow Shapley. And that was in 1950, all the way down to Carl Sagan, just short of 1980. It was about 1979. They managed to send him into oblivion. Next year, if it was 79, or 2 years later, all of a sudden, Luis Alvarez is saying that the dinosaurs and his son got wiped out by a meteorite or a comet. 2 years later. But they managed to, what that should have been is a partial triumph for Velikovsky, because he was saying this sort of stuff happened. The thing with Alvarez was saying, oh, that's 65 million years ago. And they've been, oh, really content. How much time left to go?
15 minutes. Do
Oh,
you
that's
want
good.
it?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Anyway,
Well, I'll go.
65 million years ago, we don't have to worry about comets and meteorites. Well, tell that to the people. Where was that? Someplace in the Ural Mountains. That was in this millennium. They didn't get hit by a comet or a meteorite. They're not, I suspect they think it was a meteorite that blew up in kind of like midair and took out, I'm told, 100 people, killed them, and killed about 1,000, or wounded about 1,000 more. And you know, each time something like this happens, the astronomers are going around, hey, you know, like they were saying when that happened, there was another comet. There was a comet or something that was passing really closely at the same time. It's just, what a weird coincidence. Maybe there are a few more things out there like meteorites and like rogue meteorites and comets than we've estimated. Each time they up the estimation a little bit. They're hopeless. Absolutely hopeless. Hopeless. Oh yeah, because we just don't want people to be scared about these things. You know, fear is healthy. Panic isn't. You don't want people panicking. I don't think there's any reason to panic about the possibility of a comet hitting us anytime in the near future. You never can tell. You better fear. You'd better fear. Because the sources, the ancient sources indicate this is legend/myth that something happened around the Younger Dryas. It's combined with astronomy. I was already looking at the Younger Dryas before a guy in a geology course was saying, this looks like the newest thing. He was involved in helping bring in continental drift. It took 50 years for continental drift to start really getting accepted. 50 years. Absolutely shameful. We should be looking at all the academics and have a hall of, not fame, but shame for all the guys that submarined Wegener's work for that. Witch hunted it. Absolutely shameful. What a shameful, shameful chapter in the history of science. Pretty well every geologist in that time frame between something like 1918 and maybe 1968 is a little bit late, but roughly in that time frame, absolutely shameful. There's a few exceptions like Harry Hess, who actually got a little bit of contribution from Velikovsky. He said, when they sent stuff up to the moon, they were asking Harry Hess, a geologist, the people in NASA or whatever, what should we be looking for? So he actually asked Velikovsky. Can you imagine that? Because Harry Hess knew what it was like to be an outsider, because he was ahead of the curve when it came to regular scientists accepting continental drift. He did work on magnetic reversals on the ocean on the bottom of the ocean during World War II. He knew what it was like to be an outsider. I don't think he believed anything Velikovsky had to say, but he asked him. And that's the way science should be. Hey, looks as though you put a little bit of work in. What do you predict? And so Velikovsky said, look for remnant magnetism, related to what Harry Hess was doing. Look, and understand, Velikovsky had done his homework. He knew what Hess had done, but he was trained as a doctor. Yeah. And he practiced as a psychiatrist, following in Freud's footsteps, Sigmund Freud. So look for remnant magnetism. That would be magnetism that's left in the rocks of the moon from some sort of magnetic disturbance. And guess what? They found it. They found it. So Harry Hess is a hero. He's a hero. Apparently he's a crusty kind of individual. I don't think he suffered fools gladly. I wish I could hear him. I wish someone could revive his corpse and he could be talking about some of the scumbugs that he had to deal with from World War II until, he would have made it into the 60s, almost the 70s. The moon landing was in 69. So I think he's long gone by now. But God bless Harry Hess, if you'll excuse the rhyme. I suspect he didn't believe much in God, but there you go. A good scientist. Not many of them out there. At any rate, what did Velikovsky get wrong? So he got all this material indicating the morning star caused some sort of problem. And one of the things that bothered me when I was reading this stuff, not so much in 74, but 84 when I reread this stuff after Alvarez, and after I saw that there was scientific proof for catastrophism in the history of the world, or prehistory, really. And he dug up lots of stuff. Something happened with a morning star. And it wasn't until, it might have been 20 years later, like 2000 or something like that, that I'm reading astronomy. I like reading any sort of astronomy text. I'm reading it and saying, Mercury's a morning star. And I'm going, oh, it's just anything that appears in the morning sky before the sun. And only appears there. So then I'm going, that's why it's only mentioned as a morning star and not an evening star. Whatever happened at the time of the Exodus, and understand, I don't accept that. I'm an agnostic. I don't accept the Exodus in and of itself. I only accept what I can find correlated in other traditions. And I can find stuff correlated in other traditions in the Greek tradition, in the Egyptian tradition, in the Mesopotamian tradition, which is basically history, not legend or myth, the Indian tradition, and the Chinese tradition. That's the only stuff I accept. And yeah, so what was in the sky, it was in the morning. It rose before the sun. It was coming in the sign of Capricorn as interpreted back then. As we interpret it now, it's actually in Aquarius. Aquarius, the way we've got it set out, is way too wide. Capricorn is way too short. They're next to each other, and people who are sensible would have given a Capricorn area on the zodiac that would be taken away from Pisces. You could take stuff away from Sagittarius, but Sagittarius is the proper size. You could take stuff from Aquarius and give it to Pisces, but Pisces is a huge, sprawling constellation itself. So the ideal solution, if you're looking for the way the ancients would have divided up the zodiac, which is the signs as they're arranged along the ecliptic, that's the path of the sun, not the moon, and the stars take across the sky, then that's the way you'd have it. And yeah, Eta Aquarius is quite far into what we call Aquarius, but there you go, right next to each other. That bothered me until I was looking at Velikovsky and saying, what? That's Aquarius. Everything else says Capricorn. And then I'm going, they're next to each other. They're next. It took me a little while to realize that they're next to each other. So what he screwed up was, yeah, he's right, comets, but Venus was not a comet, so far as I can tell, never a comet. It's a huge galumping thing. It's almost the size of the Earth. It's got the most regular of all the orbits of all the planets. All 8 of them. 9 when Velikovsky was around. It's the most circular. So, it just doesn't make sense that it would have one of these hugely elliptical or even parabolic orbits. Parabolic, some of the comets that we've got coming in here, they don't belong to the solar system. They come way out there. So the path is like this. It doesn't join up again. Unless they have a little encounter with Jupiter, say, that kind of draws them into its gravitational field a little bit and then makes it elliptical. So that's what happened, And but you'll find stuff that Velikovsky didn't track down. It's out there. It's not as though he exhausted the possibilities. I believe it's in Claude Lévi-Strauss, however you want to mispronounce his name, place that he's got French first name, and then Levi sounds Jewish, and Strauss can mean like an ostrich or a bouquet in German. So I'm sure he came from Alsace-Lorraine, as the French mispronounce it. It's Alsace-Lothringen in German. And yeah, so this is from, as I recall, the Amazon Basin. I took the course a long time ago. It's about 40 years ago, maybe a little less, in mythology. And this little so-called myth, I'd say it's more a legend. The morning star peed on the people, and the pea burned. Now, I don't know exactly what that burning means, but it's the morning star. It's obviously not a flood myth. It's associated with the morning star. Flood myths, the morning star, this sort of stuff that happened around the time of the Exodus is associated with Capricorn, or, strictly speaking, it's Eta Aquarius. The Chinese nailed it right. They're not talking about a constellation. They're talking about an exact star. And but there are other flood myths. There are other myths about disasters, and there's one about the flood. And don't let so-called secular humanists fool you, or secular inhumanists fool you. They go around saying, oh, the flood myth was spread around the world. And if you don't believe me, I'll track down my textbook on the Epic of Gilgamesh. The woman who put out that text, that's what she says in essence. Oh, it's a myth, basically. She didn't state it quite as poetically, shall we say, or ironically, as I put it. It's a myth. There are flood myths found all around the world. And if she maintained, if you find flood myths anywhere outside of the Middle East, i.e. Mesopotamia and Israel, those were spread there by the missionaries. Prove it. Prove it. I can, in essence, prove that there are details in the flood myth that weren't spread by missionaries. The flood myths mention the Pleiades. The Pleiades, they're not even sure if they're in the Old Testament. When I was a kid, I was raised fundamentalist, and I was raised on a mission. And when we had Bible study, we had to memorize Hurlburt's, it's kind of almost like an encyclopedia thing like this. This is like when I was in the equivalent of grade 4 and 5. 4 and 5. And I can't recall anything about the Pleiades in there. There's something that in the Hebrew, I think it's Kizel or something like that, that they interpret possibly as the Pleiades. The missionaries wouldn't have cared anything about that, wouldn't have known about it being the Pleiades. I think it's mentioned in the Proverbs. It has nothing to do with the flood, the flood account. No. When you find a flood myth, if there's enough detail, it will mention the Pleiades. Okay? This is around the world. It wasn't spread by the missionaries, and I'm telling you, there's only one way of explaining it, and that is something came out of the Pleiades. Is there a meteor shower identified with the Pleiades? It's one of the Taurids. Check it up. Something hammered us, and it was nothing like what happened around the time of the Exodus. It was a lot better than what wiped out the dinosaurs, but it's what wiped out the big things like the mammoths and the mastodons and things like that. The mammoths in the old world too. All the big critters around here. Okay?